Good evening, everyone. Apologies for the late creation of this video. As with many projects, there tends to be an energetic creative force that puts an idea into practice, kind of from potentiality to actuality. Unfortunately, sometimes the idea expands so much that it becomes a challenge to figure out even where to begin. That was an issue I've been struggling with over the past week or so. I suppose the first step, anywhere, is the only thing that can be done. I also realized that before I can get into any detail regarding alchemy or theurgy, there needed to be a few preliminary videos set out so that we can minimize all or at least most of the inherent risks into delving into these subjects. Of course, I say minimize because we can never fully move our minds into the unknown without dangers lurking in every corner. My aim is not to regurgitate things that I've been reading, because unless you're completely fascinated with the subject matter already, like ancient religious practices and philosophy, you're not going to find what I say particularly exciting. And more importantly, our understanding of knowledge is so deficient that we don't realize what true gnosis is when we actually come across it. But we need to take into consideration that all I say, and all I'm going to say, is only the surface level. The words, the names, the ideas, the concepts, all of these are simply indicators, or if you'd like, signposts, to the real life experience that resides behind them. Once you begin to observe these things and sense them as they really are, that's when your true learning can begin. I'd like to illustrate this with a real-world example. Many people I see on YouTube out there boast that they can read 4 books a day, and they offer all these different techniques for speed reading. And that's all well and good if all you're interested in is the numbers. Now, of course, you'll be familiar with this idea of quality versus quantity. It's one thing to have read 100 books, but if you haven't properly set up the quality necessary to understand and reflect on those books, you're not going to have learned very much or profited from them. That's all very non-controversial. But here's a bit of a twist in the plot. What if I were to tell you that even if you had studied for years and achieved a master's degree and then a PhD in a particular area, let's say ancient languages, and had diligently studied all the great thinkers of antiquity and were able to speak intelligibly about a comparative analysis of, let's say, Iamblichus's writings in the De Mysteris, what if I were to suggest that this intellectualization of such a body of work of Iamblichus's would bring you no closer to the essence or the heart of his teachings? What if all our erudition and learnedness is just a more sophisticated form of self-deception? What if the so-called experts in a particular field are knowledgeable, but only knowledgeable of the externals, and cannot delve deeper into the structure of reality that resides beneath the surface? The problems we face when reading do not just apply to what we read and how much, nor simply to the quality of our reading, which is of course still important. But it's incredibly dependent on what we bring prior to our reading, aka ourselves. One can read with the eyes, or one can read with the heart. Now, academia and the scholars that populate it take pride in their scientific methods, their reliance on pure objectivity. But as Carl Jung correctly asserts, everything, and I mean everything we experience, is through the framework and fabric of our psyches. If you read deeply into Jung, you'll realize the full import of what he's saying. But don't mistake this into him dismissing all sorts of phenomena in the world as a simple reduction. This is something he actually fought against a lot of his accusers who said that what he was doing was psychologism, which is this idea that any sort of phenomena that exists is simply reduced to a psychological phenomenon, therefore negates its transcendent or true spiritual effect. So this is actually something that he's been accused of by traditionalist thinkers like René Guénon, Coomaraswamy, Frithjof Schuon, and many others of that school of thought. In fact, it's quite ironic how Jung was criticized simultaneously on both sides. From the one side, from the traditionalists, as someone who reduces all religious spiritual phenomena as mere psychological experiences, And on the other side, the materialist scientists of his day as not being evolutionary enough and too mystical. With Jung, nothing escapes his interest. That's why I find his work incredibly fascinating. Even if it's about the occult, or ghosts, or telepathy, or dream states, or mystical experiences, you name it. If a human being has experienced it, and even more telling, if civilizations of human beings have experienced it, and over many, many millennia across history, he's not going to snub his nose at it and approach those things with a prejudicial, all-knowing, self-satisfied smile. There's a humility there. And I suppose the reading with the heart is a call for us to approach all of these writings with humility. It wasn't very long ago that most academics approached the study of ancient and primitive cultures with a sense of superiority, with a dismissal of their backwardness or unenlightened views. If the current state of the world is any indicator, it shows that our so-called enlightened views are just as illusory as our attachment to this idea of progress. To assume simply because we have a greater control over nature and have a microscopic view of her workings that we've somehow put ourselves into a better position to be in tune with nature and understand her. This is incredibly dishonest and deceitful. Arguably, we only have theories about how she works, descriptively, once again, through our own lenses and perceptions, colored by our own psychic substrate. And we haven't the faintest idea into how she actually works in reality. This leads into the philosophy of science. An example of this is the observer effect, where our own instrumentation and tools to observe a phenomenon, let's say at the microscopic level, actually affects the environment that we're trying to observe. If we're being honest with ourselves, regardless of all the fancy tools we have at our disposal to observe a phenomenon, it is an inescapable reality that these tools were created by humans and used by humans. We are our own limitation. There is no Archimedean point by which we can understand the world and in turn ourselves. We can never, in essence, escape our own subjectivity. At least, not by any other means but by the psyche. Jung came to this paradoxical conclusion. All is subjectivity. However, this is a big however, the deeper you delve into the psychic substratum, from the ego to the personal unconscious to the collective unconscious, the more deeper you go into yourself, the more archaic and universal these psychic contents become, and hence, the more objective psychic reality becomes. Anyway, I feel I've gone off on too much of a tangent here, but let me illustrate the problem in academia. Now, before we all fall into despair and claim that we have no sources of right knowing or means to attain clarity regarding these ancient practices, there are a few number of present-day academics who've decided to discard the pretense of scholarly detachment and quote-unquote objectivity, and to deal honestly with these works, with no preconceptions of what they are communicating, not aiming to reframe them, redescribe them into more acceptable terms or familiar ideas. In fact, that abyss between the modern and the ancient mentality is particularly vast, despite the similarities we may identify. These scholars have also been criticized by their own colleagues, but what such scholars fail to realize is that certain practices, like theurgy for instance, cannot be described or explained. You need to participate with it at its own level. Gregory Shaw is one of these world-renowned experts on iamblichus, and he has identified that, as academics, there is a strong tendency to want the practice of theurgy to be defined, explained, and understood. And to show how things have not changed really over the centuries, he illustrates the fact that iamblichus's mentor, Porphyry, as a predecessor really for the modern academic, once asked Iamblichus to provide, quote, a precise explanation of techniques for precognitive divination, i.e. predicting the future, to which Iamblichus dismisses outright. Ultimately, Porphyry has too high a reliance on discursive reasoning. Iamblichus actually says that he needs a talisman, which literally translates to counter-drug, to ward off Porphyry's magical drug-induced desire for discursive reasoning. The problem, as identified by Iamblichus, is not what Porphyry is thinking in asking this question, but the way Porphyry is thinking. It's important to emphasize here that pharmakon in ancient Greek has multiple meanings that are all interrelated. It's a powerful word that simultaneously means drug, poison, remedy, cure, and magical incantation. But an interesting point is that herein lies a mystery of the paradoxical nature of remedying a sickness. The paradox being that the poison in itself contains the cure, or in the famous Parsifal opera by Wagner, the spear that caused the wound is the only object that can heal it. The pharmakon is a magical drug that can be used as the thing that poisons our body, but in small, cleverly administered proportions can provide the means by which we overcome our sickness. The sickness is like a veil that's cast over our eyes, blinding us from the reality that we think we're experiencing. Maya, the goddess of illusion in the Vedanta school of Hindu thought, that's precisely what this veil is. There needs to be a magical incantation that allows us to experience a real metanoia that will absolutely transform and transmute the way we experience the world around us. As Jung states several times throughout his body of works, we are all little Fausts and Faustinas, if you will. We all have that will to power, the desire to assert our presence onto nature and have her bend to our plans for ego and selfish purposes. But next time something uncanny happens to you, something odd and unexpected, don't try to explain it away in rational terms in order to dismiss it and move on. That in itself is the veil of Maya. Try to catch hold of that half a millisecond when something inexplicable happens to us, some coincidence or synchronicity. In the very short time, the mind begins to deceive itself into rationally explaining it away. Of course, going into detail here will take us very far off topic, but the main purpose here is to illustrate that the criticism of intellectual hubris is not an entirely new phenomenon. The Neoplatonists also struggled with this among their members. Next videos will focus more elaborately on some of these ideas. Ultimately, each of us must independently strive to attain this type of knowing with whatever we encounter and to integrate it into our own lives. Thank you once again, and have a good night.